We're super excited to have you in Malmö in September 10th and 11th for a session around rewilding organizations and leadership. And my first question would be, why is the rewilding approach necessary and timely right now for organizations? What are your thoughts around that?
I think if you look at rewild in nature, which is a big theme in ecology, it's not about restoring the past, it's about rebalancing the present. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at. So let's take a few examples. If you look at AI at the moment, which is a big theme in organizations, the danger on that is that we spend up, AI takes over from humans and we lose the capacity to do human things. So how do we adopt the new, but also adopt the value of the past and make sure we don't lose it? So that would be one idea. The same is true, for example, on apprentice models of leadership. It used to be people stayed in one company for their entire career. They knew everybody, they developed, they networked. You can't do that in a modern company. So how do you rapidly accelerate the build of informal networks to give people the same sort of support? So it's, recognize the new, recognize the old, start to balance between the two.
Yeah, I think for me, there's something about the fundamental paradigm shift that in a lot of kind of business, organizational design and development, really following the mechanistic model of putting parts together and, hoping for some degree of replicability and you put something in, you get something out. And humans, we all know, don't work like that. And so I think for us, is, for one, giving us a space to talk about this as a fundamental paradigm shift that we're so desperately in need for, but actually the tools in order to enable a new kind of management and development of organizations. So actually not only thinking about it as an idea, but actually what are the tools and different ways of managing and working within an organization that are more aligned to an ecological model as opposed to the mechanistic model as well.
And I think it's also the anthropology. So we become very information centric. You get the consultancies drive a data-driven organization. And you can go back to Yates on that, where is the knowledge which has been lost in information? And one of the things we're starting to emphasize is you have to narrate your direction. You have to narrate where you are. And if you go and work with Maori, then you have to tell the story of your life before they'll even engage in a conversation with you, because that's your credibility. And the rich quality of narration has been lost in an over-focus on information. So that's another area we'll talk about.
Looking at some of the pieces that you've done around that, I get really interested in the concept of the constraints for rewilding. Any words that would be on that?
We're talking more about a word which is probably new to your audience, which is called an actant. So you'll find it in actor network theory. And I think one of the things to understand about human systems is we build things which actually have agency, even though they're not people. So we now talk about actors, i.e. people, which is generally roles. We talk about constraints, so things can limit things. But we also, and this has come from theoretical physics, is we talk about constructors. So those are things which are present, which transform things, but don't change in the act of transformation. So things like processes, but also things like rituals. So I think one of the things we're trying to make people aware of, and this is a complexity perspective, is the only things you can change are the actants and the way they interact with each other. And then you have to monitor the results. So actually, from a complexity perspective, organizational management becomes a lot simpler, to pick up on Beth's term, a lot less mechanical and a lot less and more natural. But what it doesn't give you is a level of predictability that a lot of people want. So one of the things we'll talk about is how do you manage inherent uncertainty? And how do you sell that upwards, sideways, and downwards in an organization?
And I think as well, to drop in a quote that, that humans shape the tools and then the tools subsequently shape the humans.
Yeah.
And actually, how do we, one, become more aware of the things that are influencing or shaping the system, and actually have some more agency to alter them or remove them or adjust them into ways that are much more generative and productive, as opposed to potentially causing all kinds of unforeseen consequences and problems.
Interesting. I spoke at a knowledge management conference in Manchester a couple of weeks ago. And knowledge management is going through one of its every 4 years resuscitation as a strategic goal before it dies again. I mean, I've lived through this so many times. But AI has given them a new lease of life. And the trouble is, just as back in 95, everybody said, let's make tacit knowledge explicit. Now they're saying, let's make abductive reasoning inductive, which is how AI works. And it's exactly the same mistake. I called it the tyranny of the explicit. And to pick up on one of Beth's terms, if you have a tool, if you pick up your tool, it should fit your hand. You shouldn't have to bio-re-engineer your hand and your brain to fit the tool. And again, that's a balancing issue. We're trying to force people into idealistic mechanical tool sets rather than seeing this as augmentation, as making humans better.
So there's going to be something around rewilding organization. Why do you think that this is, really spurring energy and engagement right now?
Because people know it isn't working. I mean, if you look at it, there's been 3 major movements in management theory. We're actually currently entering the third. The first was scientific management, and that sort of ended in the mid-80s, 90s. And actually, I mean, people decry it, but they forget what Taylor was doing was humanizing the workforce. What existed before was terrible. And he didn't automate management. He didn't automate leadership. That was something which was apprentice model. And the metaphor was a military metaphor. And of course, in a military environment, it's not all command and control, it's distributed command. People forget that part of it. Right? And by the way, Sweden is leading on this because you integrate civilian and military work in your academies, and we work with those guys. So then we get the sort of re-engineering period, which is really the popular form of systems thinking, where the metaphor is what we got is an engineering project. Yeah, and then people get designated. Psychometric tests were ignored until then. Now they come in because people have got to be categorized, because they've got to be taken off the shelf and put into the manufacturing process. And that's gone through a series of waves driven by the big consultancies, all of which have sort of promised everything, delivered very little, sometimes shifted us forward, often shifted us backward. And any sophisticated executive knows that model really doesn't work. And now I think we're in this complexity area where the metaphor is ecological and anthropological rather than medical, rather than mechanical.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of why is this so timely right now, particularly I would say with the younger workforce, people my own age, like the previous stuff just doesn't float. I think there is a fundamental recognition that it doesn't work. And if you keep applying it to particularly people of my age, you can't attract or retain them. And again, I think the issue with a lot of the kind of older paradigms, particularly around leadership, is seating, all the leadership within individual people. All the characteristics of leadership is seated within one person or a set of privileged people within an organization. And again, that's something that feels like it fundamentally doesn't work in a society that's as diverse as what ours is. So actually thinking about how is that stuff distributed, shared, and brought together at the point of need and disbanded again when it's no longer necessary. So as to kind of not ossify or become stuck in the much more mechanical sense.
And some of the work to illustrate that we're currently experimenting with in the health service, amongst other areas, is distributing decision authority and resource allocation into small groups of roles working together. Without the need for bureaucracy, we think we can take out 40 to 60% of the bureaucracy in a hospital, for example, and increase clinical engagement. Now, that's a natural science-based approach. We know the science of team formation, the maximum number of people, the way you have to have roles to reduce stress chemicals. So there's a lot of science behind that development. But what you're really saying is you've got to create more autonomy in the workforce. And I think the other thing, we've been doing work with a couple of the big oil companies, for example. They can't retain staff because nobody wants to say in the pub after work they work for big oil. So the moral imperative is also starting to change, I think, faster than people realize. One of the things we've been looking at, and we're talking about this with the big development banks as well, is how do you increase auditability of distributed decision making. And distributed decision making is very different from delegated decision making. Delegating perpetuates this myth of the heroic individual, which Beth talked about earlier. Distributed decision making recognizes that people working in roles in combination with other roles have less stress. But what you've got to have is full audit control of the process so that there's no corruption or no abuse. Now, that's what we've been working on for the past 2 or 3 years, which we're now starting to experiment with. And in a world where we're going to suffer massive strategic shocks on an unexpected basis, I mean, there'll be another 2 plagues in my lifetime, and I'm coming up to 70. You need to be able to make decisions in the field under fire fast, with rapid feedback to senior leadership and with audit control, and with the ability to do peer-to-peer learning. Everybody forgets about peer-to-peer learning. It's actually far more effective than everything moving into the center and then moving back out again.